Thanks for coming back, or coming for the first time, and I'll turn it over to our speakers. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Caleb Elfenbein. I'm an associate professor of history and religious studies at Grinnell College. And I'd like to thank Rebecca for the invitation and for organizing this gathering. I want to talk to you today about a project that I've been working on now. It's only been, I guess it's about 10 months that I've been working on this project. It was something very new for me, and I'm really excited about sharing it with you today. I'm trained as an historian of the Middle East, colonial and imperial history in the Middle East, focusing on Egypt in the latter part of the 19th century. And so working on a project about Islamophobia in the contemporary United States is something of a departure for me. But it came out of seeing a problem unfolding around us right now. And it's something that compelled me to think a little bit more seriously and concretely about a promise that I had made to myself long ago, which was eventually when if I got to the point where I was privileged enough to have tenure, that I really started thinking about being more of a public scholar and thinking about really what it was I wanted to do with my career. And in 2015, there was a marked increase in Islamophobic incidents in the United States. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I include in that broader category. But it was really quite pronounced, and now in retrospect we can see that it was roughly a 67% increase in certain kinds of crimes from 2014 to 2015. And I really started thinking about this problem through a series of questions that have been of interest to me for a very long time, but that I had been exploring in the context of Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And those questions are around how communities over time think and talk about the idea of the common good, and who gets to participate in those kinds of conversations, and on what grounds people get to participate in those conversations. How do communities think about the goals that are before them, and who gets to set the parameters of community life as people work toward those goals? So I was thinking about the problem of Islamophobia through that lens, and thinking about the common good in the modern period. And I wanted to engage the mythos of liberal politics that surrounds the idea of the West broadly conceived, or as Charles Taylor talks about it, more limited to North America and Western Europe, of free and voluntary participation in public life. That this is what liberal communities hang their hat on as separating them from the rest of the world. And I really started to think seriously about how Islamophobia constrained the participation of American Muslims in public life. How did it set the parameters for participation? And I really started to think about, like, how do you go about representing something as abstract as the conditions of public life? And the first thing that occurred to me, based on a long-standing interest, was mapping, using maps to try and represent space, and how we think about the effect of incidents in creating a certain environment of public life. And I had the real privilege of attending a great workshop by a scholar at Salem State, Rupika Rasam, on post-colonial digital humanities. And while I was there, she introduced me to a website called Mapping Police Violence, which is an incredible, incredible resource that traces killings of African American men and women in the United States. Really an amazing resource, and for the first time really impressed upon me the incredible value of data visualization. And that really settled for me the idea of using mapping to try and talk about the conditions of public life in the context of Islamophobia. And the fact that I'm presenting this project here in New York City, I think, is especially important, given that the NYPD quite famously generated a map of Muslims living in New York City as part of its post-September 11th crime-fighting effort. And so this project, for me, is very much part of what Mustafa Bayoumi, a scholar at Brooklyn College, calls a resistance to a war on terror culture, which seeks to raise questions about the presence of American Muslims in the United States. I've been working on building a data set from scratch because there is no national database for hate crimes. The FBI keeps statistics, but it's based entirely on voluntary participation by local law enforcement agencies. Moreover, it is generated according to the categories of crimes that the FBI deems important enough to track. So I really started to imagine how I was going to go about creating a data set that really spoke against common narratives about American Muslims. And the best way that I saw that being possible was to build a data set from scratch, in part because I wanted to include crimes. I wanted to include everyday harassment. I wanted to include political speech at a national level. I wanted to include political speech at a local level. This is not just about crimes, right? This is about the broader environment and what contributes to the broader environment in which American Muslims are participating in public life. So I've been using media reports that are sourced from organizations that have a clear editorial policy. Best case scenario, these are reports that have come through civil rights organizations and law enforcement. But I want this data set to be beyond the question of professional Islamophobes who talk about the American Muslim community really exaggerating the situation in the United States. So I've been working with students to build this data set. It's very slow going. We have a lot of information about 2016, 2017. It's a daily practice that I have, reading through news reports and working on the data set, and we're moving back in time toward 2001. And I can talk about that decision a little bit later. But what we have right now on the site are 3 different maps, and I'm trying to represent a few different kinds of things with these maps. So I'm sorry that this is a little difficult to see. This is a map of the United States, a very sparse map, no cities. And I wanted to use this particular color scheme to really highlight these incidents as they appear over time and in space. So this is primarily 2016 and moving into 2017. And as you'll see in a moment, the incredible spike around election time in the United States, I think, is really quite profound, and I think shows the value of data visualization to really bring this home. So we're moving into election season now in 2016. And again, this is an incredible range of activities from harassment, vandalism, assault, to national political speech and legislation targeting American Muslim communities. The second map is the data sorted by year, and again, as we build the data set, this will be a much more robust resource. Now on this map and the next map, what we've done is we've made it possible to click on each data point. And I think this is one of the things that I'm proudest of about the project and the data set. People will be able to see the year, read an event description, and follow the source that we used. So they'll be able to read more about the people behind the data points. And that is true for each and every data point on the map. And the final map is each data point sorted by the kind of incident or development that we're tracing, right? And this includes legislation, public campaigns, public speech, crimes against property, bias-related incidents, and crimes against people. In all, what the project is seeking to do is to highlight the sparsity of information that is available on a whole range of things that we can group under the broader rubric of Islamophobia, right? That this is not just about harassment, it's not just about everyday forms of violence, it's also much broader in the different things that contribute to the conditions of public life. So I'd like to talk more about the decision to use mapping to try and illustrate something as abstract as the conditions of public life, and I look forward to the conversation to follow. Thank you.
Caleb, can you hear me, or is this, it's on? I can't even tell. Thanks for having me. My name is Erin McElroy. I'm a co-founder of a project called the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is a data visualization, data analysis, and storytelling collective. You can't hear me. Is it? Is this really on? I don't think it's on either. Okay. I just have to talk really close. Okay. So we're a data visualization and radical cartography and digital humanities project that we formed in 2013 in San Francisco. I'm also a doctoral candidate in feminist studies at UC Santa Cruz, working on a project about technology and displacement. So some of that will inform what I'm about to talk about as well. There are about 20 of us in the mapping project right now. We're all volunteer activists, cartographers, oral historians, housing, justice, organizers, et cetera. We're not affiliated with a university or a nonprofit, and so everything I'm about to show you we've done on our own time because we are trying to produce data useful to movement building and to fighting against this growing context of gentrification really plaguing the Bay Area right now. So first off, I just want to show you a couple maps that have also been emerging in this kind of context of San Francisco and Bay Area gentrification. After Twitter moved into San Francisco in 2012, the mayor basically created what he called the Twitter tax break zone to allow tech to move into the city and not pay taxes. A lot of evictions ensued after that, proximate to new tech infrastructure and within this tech tax break zone. And also a lot of new development started to form. This housing development, basically a market luxury rate development, popped up right next to Twitter to house Twitter employees, and they made a map as well, basically trying to target wealthy tech workers to live in their unit. But what they did was they actually erased Chinatown from the map of San Francisco altogether, and they renamed the Castro, which is a historically gay, queer neighborhood, Eureka Heights, also erasing queer organizing history there. This is just another map that was circulating on metro trains last year, positing West Oakland, which has been a historically black working class neighborhood, as the new frontier of Silicon Valley. And as probably a lot of folks know, right now in Silicon Valley, the leading tech industries are disproportionately hiring young white men. So this is all, of course, problematic. And it's kind of against this backdrop that the mapping project formed. So let's see. I'll show you the very first map that we made, which shows the accumulation of a particular kind of eviction called the Ellis Act eviction in San Francisco over time. The Ellis Act is a California state law, so it doesn't apply to New York, but it applies to pretty much every city in California that has rent control. And what it allows is for landlords and speculators to evict tenants for no fault of their own, exit the rental market, and then flip properties and turn them into condos, and often make millions of dollars in the course of just a couple months. The Ellis Act was written in 1985. It wasn't really used in San Francisco until the dot-com boom of the late 90s and early 2000s. And then it petered out, and then we saw it rise dramatically in the wake of this new era that we're calling the tech boom 2.0, which we often cite as beginning roughly around 2011. And one of the things with the Ellis Act is there are lots of different kinds of evictions in San Francisco. We actually analyzed every single eviction that you see popping up on this screen and found that 80% of them were happening within the first 5 years of property ownership, and that 60% of them were happening within the first year of ownership alone, which tells us that these are actually speculators and not longtime landlords using this eviction technology to often displace longtime tenants, rent-controlled tenants, and take rental housing off the market and instead create often luxury condos. So we made this map after many people that we knew in our community received these types of evictions. So we wanted to know where they were happening, how they were happening, who was being evicted, and who was profiting through them. We also wanted to better understand correlations between displacement and tech in terms of tech infrastructure. We found that actually 69% of these kinds of evictions that are generally called no-fault evictions, when tenants are evicted for doing nothing wrong, were occurring within 4 blocks of what are called Google bus stops or tech bus stops. And essentially, for those who don't know, in this kind of new tech era, a lot of tech companies from Google to Yahoo, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, et cetera, have these private luxury shuttle buses that allow their workers to work in San Francisco or Oakland and take free private transportation to Silicon Valley. And of course, we love public transportation and we generally love buses, except what's happening is that property values are going up when they can be listed as being a couple blocks from the Google bus stop or the Apple bus stop. And they're also using public bus stops for free, and they were doing this illegally for years. If you or I were to load or unload passengers in a public bus stop, we would be fined by the city, but these tech companies were getting away with it. And 40% of their riders actually wouldn't have said that they wouldn't actually even be living in the city if the buses didn't exist. So again, we were also engaged in a lot of protests during this time, not calling for the end of buses, but calling for these companies to be more responsible and pay more and contribute to anti-eviction efforts in the city. We've also been tracking Airbnb and short-term vacation rentals. Of course, Airbnb formed in San Francisco in 2008. Right now, the average Airbnb unit in San Francisco is over $200 a month. And the real problem with this, again, isn't the idea of sharing housing, but of course, Airbnb is not really sharing, sorry. But that long-term housing is being converted into short-term vacation rentals. Sorry, I don't know how this works. Anyway, but what we found was that the neighborhoods with the most evictions also had the most Airbnb units, both in Oakland and in San Francisco. And let's see, yeah. We've been wanting to also figure out who's being evicted in this kind of new era. We often use city and sometimes county data to understand evictions better, but that data never tells us who's being evicted. So we've been working with a lot of housing clinics. This is a report we did recently with the Eviction Defense Collaborative, which represents about 90% of tenants being evicted in San Francisco. And they do intake forms, so we've been able to work with them to better understand the demography of displacement. And what's really stark is that right now in San Francisco, the white population is 41%, but only 17% of those being evicted are white, whereas the black population in San Francisco is only 5%, and yet 18% of those being evicted are black. We've been working in San Mateo County as well, which is south of San Francisco. This is San Francisco. This is Oakland over here. But this is San Mateo County. In addition to a similar racial bias when it comes to eviction, there's also quite a huge gender bias we found. Disproportionately female-headed households are facing eviction, and disproportionately households with children. And again, when you think about those tech hiring statistics, these are quite inverse. So in addition to looking at who's being evicted, we've been trying to understand who these evictors are. This is, we've been profiling different evictors on our site as a form of digital activism, which generally they hate. This guy, Fergus O'Sullivan, he's one of my least favorite. He has an Airbnb profile that he uses after he evicts people to then basically re-rent rooms, which is technically illegal. He has a number of limited liability companies, LLCs, that he affixes to different units. You can see, for instance, the landlord of this address, 3758 21st Street. The technical address is 3758 21st Street LLC, not Fergus O'Sullivan. So we've had to do a lot of behind the scenes research to figure out that that LLC is actually connected to him, and that he is also connected to these other addresses and LLCs, and has evicted a number of people through them. This woman, Alex, she lives in the Mission in San Francisco, and her grandmother was evicted by him at the age of 95, and she actually passed away two weeks after being evicted. We found that 72% of people being Ellis Act evicted are actually above the age of 62 and or disabled. So again, this is the reality. We've been working with a number of artists, collaborators to find different ways to embed our data and our maps in different media. This is a local singer-songwriter who made a parody of that Adele Hello video, but addressing it to the mayor of San Francisco instead. And she did this after the mayor decided to, this was his language, clear the downtown area of San Francisco of its homeless population for the Super Bowl. And literally people who were living in tents and who were houseless downtown San Francisco had to relocate their tents when the Super Bowl came to San Francisco. And this led to a huge reshuffling of people and a lot more racial profiling and homeless profiling, because people suddenly were moving to neighborhoods that didn't have as high homeless populations before. And there was this one man, Jose Luis Gongora Pot, who was evicted. He was an undocumented immigrant from Mexico living in a tent. Somebody called the cops on him. The cops killed him. So after that, we started doing a lot more work looking at intersections of racialized police violence and eviction and displacement. We made well, I don't know if I'll find it. Well, we've done a lot of mapping. We actually mapped all the police violence in San Francisco and Oakland. We've also mapped an increase of 311 calls directed towards homeless people. And we've looked at, we've made story maps using some of the Knight Foundation technology that we looked at earlier. But this one's one of my favorites. There's actually a statute in San Francisco so that the police can decide if somebody is in danger of leading an immoral life and then issue them a ticket. So we've been mapping these instances of immorality, which of course correlate with POC concentrations in particular neighborhoods. We have an oral history project that maybe is most exciting for some of the digital humanists in the room, but we've collected over 100 oral histories of people who have been evicted or negatively impacted by gentrification. We started just in San Francisco. Over the last year, we've actually only been working in the East Bay, so a lot of our new work has been in this area. But any of these blue circles you can click on and actually hear the story of somebody we've interviewed. We've been doing video work as well, and so there are a number of videos that you can also see. And the videos and the oral histories narrate not just stories of loss, but we've been really focusing on modes of resistance because we want this to be a tool. We've found through direct action and through different policy work that it is actually possible to stay in your house, even if you get an eviction notice. So we really want to also highlight those stories. And we have a mural that we made in which we featured 9 stories of people that we have oral histories of. This mural is in one of the top tourist mural areas of San Francisco. And there's a call the wall function, so you can, if you're a tourist, call this wall and actually hear 9 stories of displacement. And we made this map to actually also figure out where people were going after they were being evicted. It gets a little bit more interesting when you start to see who has ended up outside of the city post-eviction. This is throughout the state. And again, you can see more about the demography of who's being displaced. And you can actually see that 14 people out of this 500-person data set that we made ended up homeless after being evicted. These people were all evicted in 2012, and we followed up with them afterwards, and 2 people had passed away. And we made this interactive report based on our work in Alameda County, including Oakland, looking at all sorts of things. And you can go online, and there are videos that are part of this report as well. But my favorite part of the report is actually this. And I know I'm going to finish up soon. But we worked with a gallery called the Betty Ono Gallery, which is a gallery in downtown Oakland, to really repaint what we think of when we think of Oakland. I think through histories of racism, racialized geographies, et cetera, Oakland has been very historically portrayed through this very negative, pessimistic lens. And of course, gentrification is alive and well there, and we wanted to map gentrification and displacement, and we did. But we also wanted to start to think about resistance and geographies of resistance and community power. So we created this live map in the gallery that people could access for several months and use these little sticky notes and write on these different walls points of resistance and community power. And then we digitized those contents. So now it's online and people can, we just digitized it, so we haven't gotten a lot of new content since we have, but you can see these are like the little sticky notes that people have added. And then finishing up. This is a tool that we made so that you can actually look up an eviction history and figure out if there was ever an eviction there. And if so, you can pledge not to rent or buy from that landlord. And we did this after we found out that the original, well, in the late 1800s, there was a slumlord, a British slumlord in Ireland, part of the colonial project of Ireland. And the tenants in his building decided they weren't going to pay him rent anymore. And his name was Sir Charles Boycott. And that's where we actually get the word boycott. So we wanted to take that word back to its original utilization and call for people to actually boycott people who've made money by displacing other people. And you can pledge, and then your comments, if you pledge, end up there. We've been projecting some of our work as well. This is a projection where we've been crowdsourcing data online, and people can add stories, and then we project it in downtown San Francisco. Right now, this is at 6th and Market, and we're going to be moving our projection around. We just got this little car thing that has a projector on it, so we'll be able to be mobile in our projecting. Yeah, and then lastly, I just co-wrote an article with my friend Manissa, who co-founded the oral history side of the mapping project with me, really theorizing gentrification in the age of Trump, and looking at both continuities and discontinuities that we should attend to now. So that's on the Abolition blog if anybody wants to read it. So I'll end it there.
Hi, my name, I'm Julian Chambliss, professor of history at Rollins College in Orlando. I'm also the coordinator of the Africa and African American Studies program there. I'm going to talk to you about, actually, I don't know why it's doing that. What just happened? Oh, okay. That's weird. It wants me to be over. Oh, okay. I made a little PowerPoint. I'm going to talk to you actually not about one particular project, but about a cluster of projects that explore the effort to try to narrativize and elevate the Black community in the town of Winter Park, is where actually Rollins College is. Rollins College is a small liberal arts college, and a lot of the projects I'm going to talk about are actually projects we've done in class with my students, sort of digital humanities projects. I often frame this around our college mission statement, where we say we want to make our students into global citizens and responsible leaders. In the context for a history class, I often talk about the work that we do as critical making. That is, that we are creating things that are rooted in the historical narratives of the community. And in particular, I'm very influenced by post-colonial DH in the sense that I'm focused on the African American community and trying to bring their story to the fore. We often do a lot of work in the archives, but we also connect those archives with community groups. In particular, I've worked a lot in the past with the Hannibal Square Community Land Trust, which was created in about 2004 to try to respond to the displacement of African Americans that were happening in the community. We also work with the Hannibal Square Heritage Center, which is a historical center that was supported in part by the city to house some of the historical material that was created by another nonprofit organization, the Corral Day School, which is doing a documentary family history project in the community. So between those two spaces, I have some pretty consistent partners, and my goal has always been to try to tell the story of Hannibal Square in a way that acknowledges its deep and complicated history and also its importance to the city. I often say that my classroom is a platform to talk about broader issues in the community, and this idea of the collaboratory, of course I'm borrowing from a haystack, that idea of the collaboratory, that people can work together. And the archive in particular are really important because the history of Winter Park is one of the first planned communities in Florida. It was really plotted out in 1880, and integral to that plotting was the African American community. I actually are using one of the scrapbooks by the town founder, a guy named Lauren Chase. He scrapbooked a lot of newspapers and collected the story of the community. But that story over time has really been defined by the white narrative. So if you hear the city talk about the history of Winter Park, they often talk about it very deliberately as this sort of consumptive space, a sort of place really growing out of the transformation of Florida into a destination of desire in the late 1880s. Any narrative of the foundation, though, has to take into account the literal mentioning of Negro lots that were plotted out in the town plan at the time that was laid out. These lots were designed just like the lots that were being sold to white people. The lots being sold to blacks were designed for them to be a steady workforce to help create the town. And they described Hannibal Square. It was called Hannibal because that's the one black person the town founders knew. Of course, related to Hannibal, who fought the Romans. And they described it as an area designed with a church for colored people, and surrounding it will be lots sold to Negro families of good character who can be dependent upon to work in the family and in the groves. So the Hannibal Square and the lots that are in the actual town plan were sold to African Americans with the caveat that they had to build a house quickly. This was part of a kind of broader narrative in the region of having good character African Americans. There were restrictions in neighboring communities that were being sold, and we see similar kinds of restrictions around moral behavior. But that historic community of Hannibal Square is now at the center of a kind of displacement wave, the gentrification, but really displacement, as more and more development is happening in Winter Park. Here you can sort of see, this is the historic, as it's dependent on the map, but here it is as a sort of aerial view from a drone. All this has sort of appeared in the last 10 to 15 years, a complete redefining of the sort of historic core of the community. So for African Americans who live in Hannibal Square, they are faced with the sort of displacement that's taking place as more and more development has sort of accelerated after 1999 and early 2000s. That displacement has really pushed more and more African American families out of the area. And part of that is galling for them, in part because their history as a property owning, integral part of the community is almost always left out. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing is about recovering the past and telling the story of Hannibal Square, because it's actually a much more complicated story than simply an African American community with crime and a drug problem, which is sort of at the core of some of the gentrification narrative that you might hear. So the story of Hannibal Square is important because, of course, it was designed for African Americans to be there. They were required to be property owners. So in the early period of the town, they were the most consistent long-term residents. Many of the white people who were in the town actually commuted. They were snowbirds, as they always are, and they left as it got hot and African Americans were there tending to the homes of the rich people. But they were the longest sort of constant residents. And as the town had to be incorporated, it required African American voters in order for it to be incorporated. So it's the combination of African American Republican voters and white Republican voters working in tandem that allowed for the town to be incorporated. But that, of course, rubbed the Democrats in the town the wrong way. So when the town was actually incorporated in 1887, the city government included 2 African Americans who served well and helped the town grow very rapidly. But eventually the Democrats brought away to the state legislature and detached the town, right, and kicked Hannibal Square out of the town boundary. This history, the history of them as important members in helping to create the town, the history of them being detached, is almost lost except for within the black community. It's only been recently with like historical research that has been come to the fore. So one of the first projects that we did in class was a simulation on Twitter, where we had students imagine the narratives around this displacement. And so they tweeted about it. And this was a way for us to bring us out a public narrative around this and to the people on social media, and it got covered in the local newspaper. And these projects led to other projects where we sort of looked at the history of the black community in Winter Park. And in particular, we've been doing a lot with looking at long-term property owners. So we used a project this last semester using Timeline.js, and each student had a particular lot, and they sort of traced the history of ownership of the lot to sort of push back against this idea that African Americans were not property owners and African Americans did not do a good job of managing their property. There's actually a much more complicated story associated with that. This is important because the current development narrative is so pervasive that many African Americans still feel frustrated that they cannot narrativize their sort of frustration with the policies and actions of the city in terms of allowing this sort of displacement associated with development to happen. So in a lot of ways, a lot of work that we're doing is history is activism. One, we're trying to position the story of Hannibal Square in a more equal light, how important it was in terms of the narrative of the creation of the town, how important African American citizens were in terms of the town. And it's been somewhat successful. Recently, the African American editor of the newspaper called The Advocate, the Winter Park Advocate, was made a part of the Winter Park Hall of Fame. This is important because The Advocate was in fact the only newspaper in town at one point in the early history, that Gilded Age history. So because The Advocate was a sort of voice of the Republicans in town, it covered both the black community and the white community, and it too is in fragments in the archive. It was thought to be lost, and Gus Henderson, the man who was the publisher, was very active in Republican politics across the state. They actually also published, were involved in publication of a newspaper in nearby Eatonville, which was the first incorporated African American community in the United States, and also published a paper in Orlando. Both of those papers, there's no copies left, but again, looking at the fragments in our archive, we discovered that there were significant bits of the Winter Park Advocate that existed in that scrapbook by Lauren Chase, because he was a Republican. He was cutting out the newspaper stories about Republicans in the local newspaper. The local newspaper is actually a black newspaper, so it's The Advocate. So we started a project of transcribing The Advocate, that to take those bits together and try to create some sort of order to them to tell the story of the black community in this sort of Gilded Age period. Here you get a sense of the sort of politics of post-Reconstruction Florida, especially the struggles of African Americans against the declining political landscape in Florida, and that very much sort of situates the Hannibal Square story and the Winter Park story within the broader New South story of the period. And this is an ongoing project. We sort of finished the first sort of crucial period concentrating on the detachment political narrative, and now we're trying to go back and look at what else is there and see what other stories are in the archive. So these different categories, and we sort of set it up, this initial project. Ironically, the Winter Park scrapbook was actually digitized many years ago, actually not many years ago, like 2003. But the OCR on it was so bad that you can't search it. So it exists in a digital form, but it's not really searchable. So we actually have to go in and look and use the old card catalog that was created in the 1960s. And between the two, we can sort of piece together, these are elements from the Advocate, these are the stories of the Black community. This history is really important because, as I say, it informs the contemporary dialogue about displacement in the community. So this past story intersects with the contemporary debate because when people talk about the history of Winter Park, they often reference it like this, but they don't talk about the Black community that is there, that is doing quite well, that is vital. Here we have the Sanborn maps. Again, because the Hannibal Square was detached in 1893, it sort of sits outside the city boundaries, but it's still a viable community. It's still connected to the economic and social life of Winter Park. And so we're working very hard to try to piece together those stories and look at that life in a more holistic way. And this is important because this history is going to inform some of the discussions about a possible historic district, which is an ongoing process. I'm working with a group of community members. We're trying to identify spaces on the west side in the Black community that could be part of a historic district. And so piecing together a more holistic history that identifies the sort of consistency of the Black experience is quite important. At the same time, the emotional turmoil of displacement that's going on is inescapable. What's happening now, a lot of the residents think of as something the city has always wanted to do. When I first heard that, I sort of thought of it as simply an emotional response, but in fact, it is a oral history that's been passed down because in fact, in the 1950s, the city did talk about entirely eliminating the West Side when they had a nationally known planner come in and come up with a new plan for the city of Winter Park, and he talked about eliminating the West Side. So when they talk about this idea that the city always wanted to eliminate the West Side, it's because in fact there is an oral tradition that tells the story. But there's also the reality of like the sort of systemic transformation associated with ordinances, and this is another project that a student did. We used Google Maps. He got all of the ordinances that have been passed by the city related to zoning and housing, and he mapped them out. And so with this map, you can see how little by little the city has sort of transformed the West Side from a sort of residential area to upzoning, right? Like they've upzoned it to, instead of like single family homes, to mixed use homes and retail spaces. And this is sort of a systematic thing that many residents were not aware was happening. So this is a map that sort of sits on a site called Trinity. This is one of the maps. This is a map that the students have done. We've done other projects. Here we worked on a class book. We were working with the Hannibal Square Heritage Center, and we used this idea of sustainability, and a number of the students in the class wrote chapters that would go into this book, and we gave it to the members of the Hannibal Square Heritage Center, looking at different ideas around historic preservation, around cultural tourism that might be associated with this. This is an ongoing process, and I say it's a cluster of projects. A lot of this narrative becomes part of a kind of constant public dialogue. I am asked to give a lot of talks in the community. There, I'm sort of the person who gets to say the things that the community members might say, but I say it in a nicer way, and I have a PhD, so people tend to listen to me sometimes. But I'm always trying to capture how the Black community feels, and that sort of forced me to try to capture it in different ways. I do a lot of work with my colleagues in the art department, and so at one point I just made this. This is an actual picture of a coming development on the west side, and I point at this and like, this is what you see, this is what the residents see, right? This is the affordable housing that's never coming, and the sort of references of ongoing racism that's displacing them. All of these efforts are, as I say, an effort to try to create a more holistic narrative around the spaces and places on the west side. They're ongoing and not going to stop. It's in part because the displacement isn't stopping, right? We're always trying to create some sort of context to give the people on the west side a voice in terms of their history and how it sort of intersects with broader issues. Recently, we I did a pop-up exhibit with another class. Here again, we tried to contextualize the Black experience in Winter Park, but also connect it to broader Black narratives, social narratives in the region. I think it's really critically important to make the Winter Park story part of a bigger Black social world story. And that's really one of the reasons why I'm really fixated on the newspaper, because in those pages, you see the Black people there narrativizing their story within a broader national and state context. And the same thing I think is really necessary in terms of like telling the story. So I'd be happy to talk more about specifics. I didn't want to try to like go through different websites and stuff, but I can tell you about some of these projects and sort of like show live things if you want, but that's my project. Thank you.
Julian, I like that. That's good, I like it. I'll be Julian. I'm not Julian, I'm Josh. Let's see. Excellent, there we go. Great, glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry not to have been here earlier in the day, but delighted to be here now and to hear about this remarkable work. I am a geographer by training, though I often work as a writer these days. I did my degree in geography at UC Berkeley, and I left right around when Web 2.0 started, 2011, 2012. And I knew of the Anti-Eviction mapping project. It's amazing to see all you guys are still doing. It's remarkable. But in any case, I'm here now. I'm in New York City, here at the Institute for Public Knowledge, just on this floor, like 20 feet away. And I've been here working on a few projects. I work on thinking about place and difference and culture and space and the Caribbean often. But I've also been working for the last couple of years on this book. This book here, Nonstop Metropolis, a New York City Atlas, with my collaborator, Rebecca Solnit. Came out in October, a few months ago. Now it's sort of around the city. And it's a project that actually is the third in a trilogy of books that Rebecca started in San Francisco. The first one came out in 2010. Some of you may know her work since she writes like 8 essays a week and she's everywhere. But in any case, she's a force and she's been a joy to work with. And the first of these projects, Infinite City, it started really, the genesis of it was that SF MoMA, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, was having a 75th anniversary. And they're trying to figure out some cool projects to mark that anniversary with. And Rebecca, being a sort of figure in San Francisco, this great partisan of the city and writer there, they approached her and she said, I've always wanted to do an atlas of San Francisco. She hadn't done an atlas before. It was sort of making it up as it went along. But more than just making an atlas, the idea behind that first book, and then the book about New Orleans that we did, that I was involved in, and then the New York one that I co-edited with her, really the idea was to make a series of postulates or pose a bunch of ideas about cities and maps and how we experience them, vis-a-vis changing technology, vis-a-vis how we experience and think about place. One of those ideas, and a key one right from the start, was that if you think back to sort of 2007, 2008, really that's a moment when all of us, of course, started in a way, if we needed to get somewhere, type an address into a phone, and we get around this way, right? Of course, San Francisco being the center of those technologies, of that way of negotiating the world, was especially sort of prevalent and felt there, which is to say that paper maps sort of disappeared very quickly overnight. We were interested in the ways in which that may have represented a kind of impoverishment. As a friend of ours put it, and we like to quote, the phone is a great tool for getting you where you want to go. It's not necessarily that good at telling you where you are, right? Which is to say that in a lot of ways, our technologies, our navigating technologies can be passive in this way, of telling us to turn left, turn right, but not doing the broader work that a good map can do, which is give us context, right? Another idea about cities that felt important was that anyone who lives in a city, right, could map it in their own way. So there's really a kind of feminist politic here in terms of how we like to think about cartography, how we like to think about the ways in which space can be charted and mapped. Maps, of course, have this deep history of being sort of objects of authority. Maps convey a remarkable kind of authority. The sort of rhetoric of maps is extraordinary. Of course, they've been these sort of tools for states, tools for conquest, all these sorts of things. But they're also, right, can be these incredible ways not only to organize information, but to tell stories. And it's not an accident, both Rebecca and I work as writers, so we're very interested in thinking about the ways in which a good map can be a way to organize information. It can be a way to tell a story. It can also be an object of beauty. And the spirit of this project, I think it's important to say, is that it's also quite analog in the sense that we're very interested in uniquely kind of immersive quality of a good map, of a good sort of paper object, in the ways in which we experience it differently, the quality of attention we give to it. So this is a sort of paper project in that sense. It's also important to say, I think, and I'll just go through a few maps to show you kind of what we do, is that, as I say, I studied geography in a department that, at that time, and still is at UC Berkeley, was a department that has a kind of GIS swing. There are people there who are engaging in GIS and sort of using it as this remarkable tool that it is, taking data, making it visual, helping us understand certain things. But it's also a department, and I think inherited this and embrace it still, that is in certain ways skeptical of, or at least cautious about the ways in which the tool or the techniques can stand in for or overdetermine, right, the stories or the things that we want to think about. We, Rebecca and I, that is, have always been really interested in, okay, we have all this data, we have all this cool stuff we can visualize, what's the story we can tell with it, right? And I think that project and that politics and that real impetus, for me, right, I think it's only become clearer to me, anyway, how important that is. I think that our politics right now, there's a lot of ways to talk about what happened last year. But I think one way to talk about it is that there's a lot of people who said, look at the data, there's no way this person can lose, right? There's a lot of people who said, there's this guy telling stories, which might be fallacious and dangerous and awful, but somehow the guy told stories that people embraced, right? And I think that the ways in which we think about stories versus data, not that it's necessarily an opposition, but what we want to think about with maps, right, is how to get the data to tell powerful stories. This is an example from San Francisco, a map that's called Monarchs and Queens, which is sort of a standout from that book, which maps two things. And this is something we often do to take, again, just to emphasize the ways in which cities are spaces of kind of radical coexistence and contain all these places and stories in one. So this map maps butterfly habitats on the one hand and queer public space on the other, which is to say, often gay bars, both extant and those that are no longer here. But the idea here, right, it might seem sort of whimsical, it might feel like what's the point of this juxtaposition? But of course, what one can do when you put two things in conversation is again, to emphasize the ways in which cities are these places of coexistence, but you can also riff on a sort of larger story about the city of San Francisco, the city as refuge, the city as a place for literal or figurative comings out, right? The city as habitat. And so we have this wonderful essay that went with this. I should say that all these books include maps and essays that go with them to sort of amplify and narrate what the books have to say. The maps have to say, I should say. This is an example from New Orleans. We've always been interested in taking maps. Rebecca was always clear that she wanted these things to be oriented toward the north, which of course is a sort of arbitrary thing, but it's something we're accustomed to. So the ways in which we want to sort of take maps that we may feel familiar and then sort of apply a kind of détournement and mess with them to mess with our perceptions of place is something we've done. So this one just plays with our basic notion. One of the assumptions we have when we look at maps is, oh, there's sea and then there's land. And it's always represented, right, as a kind of discrete line. And so this was, the idea here in Louisiana, of course, is that that line is not at all discrete. You know, there's this whole weird marshy liminal zone. It's key to the geography of Louisiana. It's also, of course, losing land by the day. So we wanted to represent that in terms of making it sort of mushy and indiscrete, but also to show the ways in which, and you can't see it terribly well on this, but the ways in which the sea, which we think of as just water, is this heavily industrialized landscape, right? It's crisscrossed with these pipelines and oil infrastructure. One of these dots, of course, this was after the BP disaster there, so this is the oil rig that exploded. And then the birds on this are just to make it beautiful. We commissioned artists to work on these maps as well. I'll give you just like 3 from New York. This one, this is sort of in the same vein as that Louisiana map, in that we basically just were like, okay, what are the maps of New York that we're accustomed to seeing? What are some of the conventions around mapping New York City? One of the great conventions, or one of the most common ones, right, is to turn New Jersey, poor New Jersey, into the spot you put the scale or the title or the label, or you just literally dump on New Jersey. So we thought, well, it would be interesting to just sort of to mess with that, make New York background. You can't see it that well on this projection, but basically make New York background, celebrate New Jersey, which of course is an essential part of this metropolitan area, and just put a big Robert Smithson quote on top of New York saying, hasn't Passaic replaced Rome as the eternal city? But the point there, and the Smithson quote is not by accident, is that New York, of course, is this place that's made up of arrivals, among other things. That it's a place that people come to create stories or to join the story of New York, find themselves, lose themselves, whatever the mythology is. But many of the people we think of as icons of the city, right, of course, are not from here. They didn't grow up here. People say, you can come to New York and be here for a week and start complaining about the subway being late. You've joined the story of New York in a way, unlike some other cities. But what we wanted to do here is just to celebrate the subtitle of this map, or this title, I should say, The Suburban Theory of the Avant-Garde. Is this to show how many of these people, from Patti Smith to Robert Smithson to Dizzy Gillespie, are products of the burbs and of Jersey in particular. This is a map. This is actually the first map in the book. It's called Singing the City, the New York of Dreams. And the idea here was just to get at the ways in which all cities, but I think New York in particular, like London, like Los Angeles, like certain others, right, there is this way in which the mythology of the place has a profound sort of impact on the ways in which we imagine it or even experience it when we first arrive here, even if we grew up here. So this is a map that essentially just takes songs. We thought about doing movies and books and all kinds of things, but this just takes songs and puts them on the map of New York in the places that they shout out or represent. So we limited it to songs that talk about particular places. Take the A train to Absolutely 4th Street, to No Sleep Till Brooklyn, to, well, out in Queens. The one exception, we have California Dreamin' in Queens, the Mamas and the Papas. So you figure being in Queens involves dreaming of California sometimes. But that's Singing the City. Next up, the next map in the book is we get into the nitty-gritty of the city, of how that city of dreams bumps up against the city as it is. This is the sort of heavy historical geography map that maps the expanding footprint of New York, narrated through the history of capital and finance in this place. We had Richard Campanella work on that. But it's important to say that in terms of the sort of storytelling function of these things, that we've always been interested, as I say, to figure out, okay, what are the examples, what are the histories, what are the voices that make these things compelling, right? It's just like writing an essay, right? Every good piece of writing implies a map. Every good map implies a story, right? And so what we're interested in is not saying here's 8 million pieces of data. We're saying here's 8 through which we can sort of narrate and synthesize a story of this place. We were committed from the start to do all the boroughs, not just make it a sort of New York and a little Brooklyn. So this is a map of Queens, and in particular, it's a map of linguistic diversity in Queens. Queens being, as some of you may know, right, not only the most diverse of the boroughs, but it's the most linguistically diverse place on Earth. You know, there are a few square miles in which something like 800 languages are spoken. And we partnered with a wonderful linguist at the Endangered Language Alliance to help us chart these languages, but also to chart, and you can't read this, of course, but these little pieces here are these sort of hot spots, these examples that help us tell the story, which is to say, around languages or people that, it's not just that there's Spanish and Italian and Chinese, right? There are all these languages, dialects from the Himalaya or indigenous languages from Mexico, which are spoken by very few people in the world, right? But some of them are in Queens, you know, driving cabs, washing dishes, whatever they're doing. This is a map, Riot, where we map all the riots in the history of the city. This is our one kind of imaginative cartography here. Archipelago, which riffs on the ways in which New York is both a city of islands and a deeply Caribbean city. Something like 2 million people here of Caribbean descent. So this is our kind of lie that tells the truth map, right? But I think the idea is to help us see New York in a fresh way. And I'll show you one more. Sorry. We have Wu-Tang. We have the Wu-Tang Clan, Shaolin. We have our carbon map, carbon footprint across the city. We have City of Women. Some of you may have seen it, sort of getting around the internet. This is in a lot of ways our simplest map. We basically just took, this is Rebecca's concept, we just took the map that people are most familiar with in New York, which is the subway map, right? Which of course is interesting because it's a deeply inaccurate map in all kinds of ways, right? Manhattan's all huge and fat, and Staten Island's tiny, and Manhattan's straight up and down, which is not all of these things, right? But it is the map that people are familiar with. And so the ways in which we tweaked it was just to take every stop, or nearly every stop, and replace its name with the name of an illustrious woman who was associated with that part of the city. The idea there being two things. One, just how does that change our perception of the city? It's a comment, of course, on public space and gender. But it's also, as Rebecca put it, her sort of coinage for this one was that New York City, like most cities, is in profound ways a manscape, which is to say that 90+% of everything here is named after a man, right? We have some women in public space, but most of them are not named. You know, we have Lady Liberty, we don't have Emma Goldman, right? So the idea here was just to get at some of those issues, but also to celebrate, of course, the ways in which women have shaped this city from the start. And this is the final one I'll show you, sort of a goodnight moon map. This is a map of Harlem we call Black Star Lines, and it was important for us to have a map of Harlem as the historic Mecca, so to speak, right, of African America, center of black culture in New York City. But of course, we didn't want to make it just a kind of Black History Month, here's where Duke Ellington was, and here's where Malcolm X was, and so on. We wanted to get at a sort of deeper sense of Harlem as destination and as symbol and as sacred space. And the way that we figured out eventually to do that was to essentially look at the actual built environment of Harlem and to look at the fascinating ways in which there's so many spaces of worship there, right? Mosques and churches and synagogues as well, and others. And also, of course, this great plethora of theaters, of performing arts spaces. But there's this fascinating way in which many of the theaters have been churches and then become theaters again. There's this way in which these spaces have actually been sort of sacred and secular over and over again. So essentially, we've mapped many of those places that have been both of those things, as well as some places that are just secular, sacred places, like the Apollo Theater. And the way in which we got at the kind of cosmic aspect of this and the routes and routes that we're talking about. The background here, and this is just the sort of art gesture, but is a star chart of the sky over Harlem in 1934 on the night that the Apollo Theater opened. So that's what you're looking at here. In any case, the idea here, and I can just sort of conclude by saying, that as I say, we're interested in the incredible power of maps to posit a sort of vision of history, a vision of place, to help us deepen our understanding of place and its potentialities. But for maps to be effective and to be beautiful, I think they have to be, about story. That in a certain ways, we're a narrative species. We like stories. So that's what we try and think about in these things. Thanks. I'd like to talk more.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for such a stunning display of these DH projects that really speak to, that have such a purpose. I think too often these projects don't necessarily have a really good focus or purpose, and these are wonderful examples. I have lots of questions for everyone, but Josh, I was going to start with you because your example is the one that we've seen that's not digital. And seeing the book makes me want to have it and makes me then wonder how much it is because it is so beautiful. And then I wonder whether or not you and Rebecca had discussed digitizing the book. And what might be lost or gained in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Well, the paperback's not that much, so it was important to you could put it in a backpack and take it around. But yeah, no, the digital question here is interesting. Something we've thought about a lot. It's important to say that actually I didn't show you. There's a couple maps in this book which do really explicitly draw on digital tools, which is to say we have some maps that are, we partnered with a cartographer who does this data sweeping stuff about 311 complaints, in particular on crime statistics in New York. This map we did called Love and Rage, which looks like a kind of GIS map. It would have been impossible to do without it. But then we, of course, pulled out what are the 311 complaints we're interested in? We had noise complaint, house of worship was one that we had. Anyway, we pulled out the examples that sort of told the quirky story we wanted to tell. But to answer your question specifically about digitizing it, we have basically, because the sort of spirit of the project was to think about paper maps and their unique power, we have been essentially sort of resistant to making a digital version of them, which is to say, doing that kind of wonderful interactive stuff that, we've seen here, that hasn't really been what we've tried to do in part because we're thinking about, okay, what was great about 19th century maps and atlases, and why were they so beautiful and powerful, and what can we do that's like them? That said, we have enjoyed circulating some of the images of the maps online, and we've for a while we're like, we shouldn't do that, and then we're like, oh, it's too, we got to do a little of that. So they get around a bit, but anyway, I think it's important to say too that it's located in San Francisco. The genesis of this thing was in San Francisco, and there was a serious conversation going on about these companies and certain presumptions about knowledge and the inordinate amount of power they have, in particular kind of Google map image of the world that says, oh, we're mapping the whole thing, the whole world. And you say, well, you're mapping a version of it. And so it was important to us to kind of, there was a kind of pushback there, which is to say we didn't jump at like making it super digital because we were like in San Francisco and being like, we don't want to do that. But anyway, I think we'll have to keep talking about and thinking about how to make it digital in good ways, I think.
Hi. Oh, God. Okay. I guess this is kind of a question for all of you. I'm a studio artist here who's been learning about digital mapping and digital humanities. And I use both digital mapping and sort of craft in like my artistic practice. But I'm really kind of struggling with questions of artistic activism, and I'm wondering if there seems to be this kind of through line in all of your work that like documentation of history and documentation of kind of demographics and movement and stuff can serve as a form of activism because it's like a resource. But I'm wondering about what kind of discussions have been happening in your circles about kind of the relationship between thinking of artistic activism or digital humanities activism as a resource and thinking more about like direct action and how your projects, not that they're not amazing and wonderful, this is just sort of something I'm struggling with. Oh shit. How can your digital mapping or digital humanities be a more active form of change? Or how do you see them impacting more like direct action? Is my question.
I can start maybe. Is this on? I really can't tell. Okay. No, I think that's a really good question, and it is something we're constantly thinking through. A few of our projects, I think, directly speak to, or were directly conceived as direct action projects. Like that landlord page I showed you, we actually have I think we have almost 30, maybe almost 40 of these pages now that we've created on various real estate speculators. And we've actually taken half a dozen down, bargaining with landlords to take down their page if they stop an eviction. So that's like this very direct way, and it has worked. I mean, they're one-offs. It's not like we're fixing an entire problem, but we are helping keep people in their homes. And I also organize with a group called Eviction Free San Francisco, which is a direct action mutual aid group. And often we'll do research on particular landlords when tenants come into our meetings, which are open, anybody can come to, describing a particular eviction. And they'll be like, for instance, I have this friend, Benito, and he came in and was like, I'm being evicted by Pineapple Boy LLC, but didn't know who that was. So we did all this research and found out that Pineapple Boy LLC was the co-founder of a real estate group called Vanguard Properties. And then we ended up doing 4 different occupations of Vanguard Properties. And on the 4th one, they pushed us out so violently, they thought that we were going to sue them. And then they withdrew the eviction. So we didn't sue them. So maybe those are just a couple examples. But yeah.
Since I get to work with faculty in the context of our African American Studies program, we've done things like documentary photography projects. So my colleague Dawn Rowe has a project where she's photographing the Black community. She's photographing Hannibal Square. She's making it into a documentary photography archive, and so she can document the community. But in turn, that becomes really important because one of the things that the city always is trying to navigate is not being labeled like that they're displacing people, right? That they're pushing people out. And so by documenting the community, on the one hand, there it opens the narrative to critique and ties together displacements in other parts of the city, because at some level, all of Orlando it's under pressure from speculators, because those same speculators that have been speculating in Miami, now they're going for other places, like they're coming to Orlando and they're speculating there, like they speculate downtown in Orlando, and that pushes people to the Milk District, which is a neighborhood adjacent to downtown, which raises the rents and pushes people out there. And so by sort of spotlighting the instances of speculation and spotlighting transformation, it adds to the narrative of activists who are talking about the need for affordable housing, the need for interventions in the housing market. That is perhaps the way that artists can do a lot, because another project I did with another member of the art department, we took the Chamber of Commerce's historic slogans for the city, and used those to help students create new posters that reimagine the history of the town, but Black people were part of the history. So the Black spaces were an integral part of the city. Had a slogan at one point, City of Homes. But of course, all the homes that they always fixated on were the white homes. So what would it mean to say City of Homes and African Americans are integrated into that tableau? And so they imagined new posters and new ad campaigns around that idea. So art becomes a way to imagine a different mode, a different framework that's more inclusive. And that becomes really interesting for people who see it. But there is a gap between that and policy. So like I say, I work a lot with community institutions, some of which are directly associated with housing, but they ebb and flow. Community institutions are successful, but they have a cycle. When they have strong leadership, they can be really active. When they have weak leadership, they can be not so active. So we kind of become a constant partner that can be dedicated to a particular kind of like assessment and narrativizing. And in a lot of ways, it is creating that constant narrative that helps keep the problem in the forefront of people's mind.
It's a really excellent question, and something that I struggle with quite a bit. When I saw the title of this panel, I panicked a little bit, because it is something that I struggle with and think about a lot. As I mentioned, I've been working on the project for only about 10 months, and the impetus behind the project initially was, I can't believe there's nothing out there that's doing this work. So ProPublica just started a project called Documenting Hate, which is crowdsourced, and there are various other resources, but there's really nothing like this. And the data set is freely available for people to work with. I've coded all of the different kinds of events and developments. And so my real focus initially was just getting this up and online, and beginning to share it with journalists. So really targeted communication with journalists whose work I really respect in and around discussions of hate, and just wanting to provide this resource to people who already have more well-established public voices than I have. But in really thinking about now how I engage a little bit more directly in activist work with the project, more recently I've been looking for grant opportunities focusing on public humanities, and I'm working with a local library to develop a grant proposal that would make it possible for me to travel around the U.S. to public libraries to present the work and to think through with local communities. I'd really like to do it. I teach in a pretty rural area, and I'd like to visit similar communities around the country and really talk to them about what's happening in their region and highlight the stories of people whose lives are unfolding around them, but they might not know about. So that's, right, when I'm thinking about the idea of public humanities and a kind of activism, it's in that area, I think, that I'm really interested in pursuing.
You know, just a super quick comment that I love hearing about all these projects, some of the interesting ways in which thinking about disseminating stuff, but through, in a certain way, a kind of artistic practice. I mean, I love hearing, you know, messing with the sign stuff, but also, Erin, the thing about that you guys are driving around now, projecting maps on buildings. I think it's fabulous. But that is to say that I think that being inventive about the ways in which things are circulated, I think, is super important. And we had a funny thing with our subway map that we were nervous for a while that the MTA was going to be like, that's not okay, because they're serious about their trademark. Eventually, they sort of said it was okay because it's University of California Press. And like, okay, it's like a nonprofit press, it's okay. And then, but we want to like really get the map around and like maybe put it on subway cars and stuff. We had an encouraging thing that when it came out, we were nervous they were going to be mad again. And they were one of the first people to tweet it. The MTA was like, how cool would it be to put a bunch of women on our subway map? Like, yeah. Excellent. So maybe they'll let us put it on subways. We'll see.
I have a curious question. In working on this book, New York City, did you consult with the district needs statement?
With the what now?
District need statement. The district need statement is a document that each community district in the city has to prepare. In return, they turn it over to the city, who would turn it over to the mayor's office in order to provide the annual budget for the mayor.
Okay.
And the reason I asked that is because the district needs statement has a map on it also of the city, and then each district would take a part of the city maps and incorporate it in their budget and give detail of each district, demographic, ethnic, and different type of business, whether religious, beauty salons, you know, whatever, and community facilities, police precinct, hospitals, schools, all these things.
Yeah.
Are there in the district needs statement. It's available online.
Excellent. Yeah, no, we didn't consult it, but I'm delighted to learn of it.
Because I used to work for the city as a graphic designer.
Ah, okay. Oh, excellent. Yeah. No, the city planning, I mean, we had various of our cartographers consult with, you know, various data they've compiled, but I wasn't familiar with that, but that's very interesting to think about. Yeah, what, essentially that grassroots sort of what do districts need, right? Communities. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Excellent. Yeah. Cool.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you. Wonderful presentations and visually speaking, a really very rich panel. I was super impressed, well, by all of you, of course, but I was especially super impressed by the project on the anti-eviction project. I mean, the richness of it. And so my apologies for a very practical and a very materialistic question, but you said it was an independent project that was not connected to a university or an NGO. So my first question would be, was this a conscious choice, or is it just a practical reality? And I was also wondering, because you often see this kind of projects, being established, you're like, oh, this is great. And then you look at this website a year later and it's dead. So who's maintaining it? And how do you guarantee like long-term maintenance? And also, do you use crowdsourcing? Like, who is providing the data? Just, again, sorry for a very practical question, but I'm really curious about that.
Thank you. Those are all good questions, and I'm constantly thinking about all of them, actually. So we began in 2013. Initially, it was just 4 people. 3 of them had to leave the city because it was too expensive shortly after. So I've kind of built up a new team. Mostly, like, we began thinking we were just going to make 1 or 2 maps that were going to show a couple types of evictions, and that would be that. So we didn't do that like beginning work of applying for grants or setting up particular project infrastructure. And I think because it is this sort of crisis situation in San Francisco, and because none of us, this isn't the full-time job of any of us, we all have other things. Like, we always deprioritize funding and kind of comprising some sort of sustainable infrastructure, and yet it keeps on going and more people keep on coming. And at this point, we've developed, I think, over 30 community partners that we do work with, and we're part of different coalitions. There's a San Francisco-based coalition, a regional coalition, a statewide coalition, a national coalition. So I don't think we're going anywhere. We've considered archiving some of our material with the San Francisco Public Library. They've offered to do that, but because we want to be able to take things down, and also at times we actually want to take oral histories themselves down, because different tenants end up in different legal battles with their landlords, and sometimes ask us to take their stories down. So because of that, we want to be in charge of what's up and what's down. So we haven't gone through with the archiving yet, but eventually we will do that, and we're in those conversations with them. But I do most of the site maintenance myself. Some other people help with it. We do have a lot of students who intern with us and volunteer. And we've been working with a number of university classes and producing some content that way too, and as like the community partner element for sort of community engaged learning. So that's sort of our newest collaboration or mode of collaboration, but yeah.
Aha, it's exactly 4 o'clock. Perfect. You're all staying right on my schedule. All right. Well, thank you, Caleb and Erin and Julian and Josh, for your presentation. This was really wonderful. I wanted to give you guys a sense of what's coming next if you're going to stick around. So let me give that schedule to you right now. So you have a 15-minute break. Enjoy the coffee. Enjoy the cookies. At 4:15, there are 3 simultaneous workshops happening. One will be in this room. It's actually 2 workshops back-to-back, practical data workshops. So the first one is called Collecting and Protecting Your Data. So that'll happen for 45 minutes. And then right after that will be free and open source digital tools. And both of those will be taught by Nick Wolf and Vicki Steves from NYU's Data Services. So I'm very excited about that. If you would like to take a walking tour instead with Noah Fuller, who was here a little bit earlier, he is going to start the walking tour right outside this building, and it'll be around the East Village. You should bring a smartphone with you, and hopefully you have comfortable shoes on, but it's a beautiful day, so this sounds like a really nice thing to be doing. So the walking tour is an interactive guide to walking practice in the East Village. And then also, simultaneously, downstairs in room 222, the secret hidden floor of 20 Cooper Square, if you've ever been in this building before, you may not have known there was a second floor. You'll go to 222 on the second floor and see Jenny Kajowski over here. She's going to do a workshop on project development, helping to facilitate any projects you might have in mind. Jenny, could you also announce that grad student award thing that you told me about, grad student project, when you at that? Okay. Okay. Anyway, that's something that might be of interest to some of you too. Later this evening, if you still have the energy, I hope you do, because it'll be really great. Leah Meisterlin and Garago, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your name, so I'm going to screw it up, from Gergely Bikes from Columbia, and Barnard are going to be giving a keynote speech called Data, a keynote talk, not a speech, called Data in Context, Lessons from Urban Space. That'll also be in this room starting at 7 o'clock. So lots of stuff still happening. It's a day-long symposium, that's what happens. So thanks everybody for your attention, and thanks again for this panel.